In the woods of Putnam County, about 60 miles north of Manhattan, there are stone chambers hidden inside hillsides. They are built without mortar. Their walls curve inward using a construction method called corbelling, a technique associated with the Bronze Age. Some are more than 30 feet long and 10 feet wide, with ceilings made of granite slabs so heavy that moving them would have taken days. Every single entrance faces south, southeast, or southwest, and the gaps in the walls align with equinox and solstice sunrises. There are over 200 of them across the Hudson Valley and southern New England. Nobody knows who built them. Nobody knows when. The New York Times reported that they have never been seriously studied because nobody has ever produced evidence of anything but colonial origin. But a colonial farmer building a root cellar does not use corbelling. A colonial farmer does not align his doorway to the winter solstice. And a colonial farmer does not move multi-ton granite slabs when he could dig a hole in his basement. Something else built those chambers. And they are not the only structures in New York that do not fit the story we have been told. These are 10 ancient structures in New York that no one can explain. Before we go any further, like this video and drop your town and the time you are watching in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches and who is watching at 2 in the morning. Let us get into it. Number 10. The Lewis Hollow Cairns. A couple of miles east of downtown Woodstock, on the southern slope of Overlook Mountain in the Catskills, there is a 38-acre ravine called Lewis Hollow. Scattered throughout the forest are stone structures that are clearly man-made, some measuring up to 100 feet long and 4 feet high. There are cairns, stone walls, and formations that researcher Glenn Kreisberg identifies as snake and turtle effigies, shapes that carry deep spiritual significance in Algonquin and Haudenosaunee traditions. Kreisberg, a radio frequency engineer who stumbled across the site in the mid-2000s while attending a public hearing about a cell tower, has spent nearly 2 decades studying Lewis Hollow. He believes the structures are the remains of what he calls a ceremonial stone landscape, built by indigenous peoples for purposes connected to astronomy. He points to the resemblance between the site's layout and the Draco constellation in the northern sky, and to alignments with solstice and equinox sunrises. The Overlook Mountain Center recently received luminescence dating results that placed one of the cairns at approximately 1550, potentially making it the oldest stone structure in Ulster County. That date is significant because it falls well before European settlement of the region. If the dating holds, it rules out the most common dismissal, that these are colonial-era field clearing piles or property walls. Not everyone agrees. Joseph Diamond, an anthropology professor at SUNY New Paltz, called Kreisberg's theories nonsensical and said there was no evidence that the Lenape, the indigenous people of this region, ever used stone for construction. Diamond believes Irish laborers built the formations in the late 19th century. But that conclusion has its own problem. A University of Washington-led team dated the site to 1550 using optically stimulated luminescence, and similar stone complexes have been found across the northeastern United States, including a site in Pennsylvania dated to 570 BC. The honest answer is that nobody has settled the question. The cairns sit in the forest near Woodstock, visited by hikers who walk past them without knowing what they are looking at. Number 9. The Lake George Ancient Site. In 2013, New York State Museum archaeologists conducting a survey ahead of a $3 million improvement project at Million Dollar Beach on the southern end of Lake George found something that stopped the construction in its tracks. Buried beneath the parking lot, they unearthed thousands of arrowheads, stone tools, and other artifacts dating back to approximately 8,000 BC. That makes this site roughly 10,000 years old, placing it among the earliest known occupied locations in the state of New York. The people who camped here were Paleo-Indian hunter-gatherers living in the wake of the last glacial retreat, when Lake George's shores would have looked nothing like the resort destination they are today. The landscape was tundra transitioning to boreal forest. Caribou and mastodons were still in the region. State Museum archaeologists Daniel Mazzo and Aaron Gore led the excavation, sifting through buckets of rock and sediment. The sheer volume of artifacts suggested not a single campsite, but a location used repeatedly over thousands of years, a place that people kept coming back to, generation after generation, for reasons the material record cannot fully explain. Was it a seasonal gathering point? A trading site? A spiritual location? The artifacts are now in storage at the State Museum in Albany. The parking lot was eventually repaved. 10,000 years of human presence, buried under a beach parking lot, discovered because someone decided to fix the road. Number 8. The Casadaga Lake Mounds. About 7 miles south of Fredonia in Chautauqua County, 3 lakes form a blobby L shape on the map. Nestled just north of the bend is the modern community of Lily Dale, the world's largest spiritualist community, where registered mediums offer readings and residents have been communicating with the dead since 1879. But the land was doing something similar long before the spiritualists arrived. Early settlers documented a concentration of earthwork monuments on the east side of the Casadaga Lakes that was extraordinary even by the standards of Western New York, which was full of them. Historian and local explorer Dr. T. Apollyon Cheney visited in 1859 and recorded a mound in the yard of Dr. Thomas Phillips that was 7 feet high, even after decades of damage from farming and amateur excavation. The number and density of mounds led researchers to describe the area as a prehistoric necropolis, a pan-Native American city of the dead. Nobody knows which people built the mounds or precisely when. The Seneca, who occupied the region in the historical period, did not claim them. The earthworks predate the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Their builders left no writing, no pottery distinctive enough to identify them conclusively, and no oral tradition that has survived into the present. The mounds have been damaged, flattened, and built over for 2 centuries. Some were taken apart by amateur treasure hunters in the 1800s looking for burial goods. Others were simply leveled by farmers who saw them as obstacles. What remains is a modern spiritualist community dedicated to speaking with the dead, sitting directly on top of an ancient cemetery whose dead have never been identified. The coincidence has not been lost on anyone. Whether you believe the spiritualists are connecting with something real or not, the land beneath their feet has been associated with death and the afterlife for far longer than any of them have been alive. That is the kind of layering that makes New York's ancient history feel less like a subject and more like a haunting. Number 7. The Kuwango Earthworks. The Kuwango Creek is a slow-moving, 70-mile tributary of the Allegheny River that cuts through Little Valley and meanders back and forth over the border between Chautauqua and Cattaraugus counties. It carves a valley through the hills of western New York, and along the high points of that valley, early settlers found something they could not explain: ring forts, earthwork enclosures on hilltops and ridgelines, positioned to overlook the creek and its approaches. Dr. Cheney documented them in 1859 in his illustrations of the ancient monuments in western New York. He described circular and elliptical earthen embankments, some 12 feet high, surrounding enclosed areas that appeared to be defensive positions. Inside one mound near the creek, he recorded 8 large skeletons. The structures do not fit neatly into any known cultural period. They predate the Seneca. They are not consistent with the Hopewell tradition that produced earthworks further south in Ohio and the Mississippi Valley. Their purpose, whether military, ceremonial, or both, remains debated. The ring forts were positioned with clear strategic intent, on high ground with sight lines to the valley below. Whoever built them understood terrain, defense, and the movement of people through a landscape. But the mounds inside them suggest burial, not battle. Were they fortified cemeteries? Sacred hilltops that also served as refuges during conflict? Communities of the living built on top of communities of the dead? Western New York was full of these earthworks when the first settlers arrived. Squire and Davis documented them in their landmark 1848 survey, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. Henry Schoolcraft noted them. Reverend Samuel Kirkland, Protestant missionary to the Iroquois, remarked on their prevalence in a corridor running from the Ridge Road south through the Genesee Valley. But almost none of the Kuwango sites have been formally excavated by professional archaeologists. Some are still visible from the air, faint rings in the grass on hilltops above the creek. Most have been damaged by nearly 2 centuries of farming. The earthworks remain, like much of New York's ancient landscape, studied enough to be interesting and not enough to be understood. Number 6. The Lamoka Lake Settlement. Lamoka Lake is a quiet public lake in Schuyler County, in the southern Finger Lakes. In 1905, Arthur Parker, an archaeologist at the New York State Museum in Albany and a member of the Seneca Nation, first learned that the lakeshore might be significant. It took 2 decades before a proper dig began. In 1925, Parker and William Ritchie started excavating, and what they found redefined the understanding of prehistoric New York. Storage pits, hearths, floor outlines that indicated small houses, human burials, shell disc beads, copper foil, distinctive narrow-stemmed projectile points, and massive quantities of animal bone, particularly deer and fish. The site was not a campsite. It was a permanent settlement, one of the earliest in the northeastern United States, occupied by a hunting and gathering culture that radiocarbon dating placed at approximately 3500 BCE. That is 5,500 years ago. The Lamoka Lake culture, as it came to be known, was distinct from anything previously identified in the region. These were not nomads passing through. They built structures, stored food, buried their dead with intention, and stayed in one place long enough to leave a deep, stratified archaeological record. Ritchie spent decades studying the site and identified it as the type site for an entire cultural phase in northeastern prehistory. The narrow-stemmed projectile points found here became the diagnostic artifact for identifying Lamoka-era sites across the state. What remains unexplained is why here. What was it about this particular lakeshore that drew people back for centuries, long enough to build a permanent community in an era when almost everyone else in the region was still moving seasonally? The lake itself is small and unremarkable by Finger Lake standards. There is no obvious strategic advantage, no rare resource, just a quiet body of water in a wooded valley where, 5,500 years ago, someone decided to stop moving and stay. The settlement is now a registered archaeological site, but it is not open to the public. It sits quietly on the lakeshore, unmarked, in a part of the Finger Lakes that most tourists drive past on their way to wine tastings. Number 5. Ganondagan. In the town of Victor, about 20 minutes southeast of Rochester, there is a hilltop where the most important political event in pre-colonial North American history may have taken place. Ganondagan, the Seneca name meaning town of peace, was the largest Seneca village of the 17th century. At its peak, over 150 bark longhouses stood here, housing an estimated 4,500 people. But Ganondagan is not on this list because of its size. It is here because of what happened inside one of those longhouses. According to Seneca oral tradition, this is where Jikensace, now known as the Mother of Nations, proposed the solution that brought the Onondaga into the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the political alliance of 5 nations that became one of the most sophisticated systems of representative government in the pre-modern world. The United States Senate formally acknowledged the Haudenosaunee contribution to the development of the American Constitution in a resolution in 1988. In 1687, the Marquis de Denonville led a French army into Seneca territory and destroyed Ganondagan. They burned the longhouses. They destroyed an estimated 1.2 million bushels of corn in a fortified granary on nearby Fort Hill. The intent was to starve the Seneca into submission. The Seneca survived, but the town was gone. Today, Ganondagan is a National Historic Landmark and the only New York State historic site dedicated to a Native American theme. A full-size replica bark longhouse stands on the property, fully furnished with reproductions of 17th-century Seneca objects and colonial-era trade goods. The Seneca Art and Culture Center, completed in 2015, tells the broader story of Haudenosaunee contributions to art, culture, and governance. 569 acres of rolling hilltop are laced with interpretive trails, and a third trail leads to Fort Hill, the site of the destroyed granary. But walk those trails on a quiet Wednesday morning, and the scale of what was lost becomes physical. 150 longhouses, 4,500 people, a fortified granary that was called the breadbasket of the Haudenosaunee, a woman named Jikensace, buried somewhere nearby, whose political proposal helped create a confederacy that influenced the Constitution of the United States. All of it burned in a single military campaign because the French wanted control of the beaver fur trade. The birthplace of American-style representative democracy was a Seneca longhouse in Victor, New York, and a French army burned it to the ground 339 years ago. Number 4. the African burial ground. In 1991, construction crews excavating the foundation for a federal office building at 290 Broadway in Lower Manhattan, just north of City Hall, hit something 30 feet below the street. Human remains. Then more. Then more. In total, the intact remains of 419 men, women, and children of African descent were exhumed from the site, where they had been buried individually in wooden boxes. Nearly half were children under 12. Historians and anthropologists estimate that as many as 15,000 to 20,000 Africans were buried in this 6.6-acre area between the middle 1600s and 1795. It is the largest and earliest colonial-era cemetery for enslaved African people ever discovered in the United States. The burial ground had been in use for over 160 years, and then, as the city expanded north, it was simply paved over and forgotten. For 300 years, Lower Manhattan conducted its business, built its courthouses, and parked its cars on top of 15,000 graves. The discovery shattered a widely held myth that New York was not a center of chattel slavery. By the time of the Revolutionary War, New York had more enslaved people than any colony except South Carolina. 40% of households in colonial New York City owned at least one enslaved person. The skeletal analysis, led by Howard University biological anthropologist Michael Blakey, revealed a community defined by brutal physical labor, poor nutrition, and extraordinary mortality. Approximately 40% of deaths were children. About 2% of the population lived beyond 55. In 2003, the 419 remains were placed in mahogany coffins and carried by procession through 5 cities, starting at Howard University where they had been studied, traveling through Philadelphia, Newark, Wilmington, and Baltimore before arriving in New York City. The coffins were carried on a boat to a port in Lower Manhattan, the same port where the original slave trading ships had docked 200 years earlier. The remains were reinterred at the site where they were found, in a ceremony that lasted 6 days. In 2006, the African burial ground was designated a national monument. A memorial by artist Rodney Leon now stands behind the federal building, featuring a circle of polished black granite surrounding a triangular passage that leads to a map of the African diaspora. Today, you can visit the memorial and the visitor center at 290 Broadway. It is free. It is open to the public. And it sits in the middle of one of the busiest commercial districts in the world, a few blocks from City Hall, surrounded by courthouses and office buildings on top of 6 acres of graves. Beneath the streets of the most famous city in the world, 15,000 people lay forgotten for 3 centuries. The structure that needs explaining is not the burial ground itself. It is the 300 years of silence that buried it. Number 3. The Stone Chambers of Putnam County. In the forests of Putnam County, about 60 miles north of New York City, there are stone chambers built into hillsides. They are not the remains of old houses or barns. They are something else entirely, and after decades of debate, nobody can agree on what. The chambers are built without mortar. Their walls curve inward using a technique called corbelling, in which layers of stone are progressively angled toward the center to support massive capstone slabs that form the ceiling. Some chambers are more than 30 feet long and 10 feet wide, with ceilings exceeding 6 feet in height. Every entrance faces south, southeast, or southwest. The gaps in the walls appear designed to admit sunlight at specific times of the year, aligning with equinox and solstice sunrises. There are over 200 of these chambers scattered across Putnam County, as well as parts of Westchester, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Vermont. The most common explanation is that colonial farmers built them as root cellars. But Garrison resident Chip Marks, who has studied more than 24 chambers in the region as well as ancient structures in Egypt, disputes this flatly. While buildings erected by settlers and colonists had straight walls, he notes, the chamber walls are corbelled like igloos. A settler carving a homestead out of the forest would put his effort into building a house and a barn, not a root cellar that required moving massive pieces of rock. Robert Funk, former chief archaeologist for the New York State Museum, told the New York Times in 2001 that the chambers had never been seriously studied because nobody had ever produced evidence of anything but colonial origin. But the absence of study is not the same as evidence of colonial origin. No artifacts have been found inside or near the chambers. No deeds, no tax records, no construction logs connect them to any known colonial builder. The corbelling technique is associated with ancient construction traditions in Ireland, Scotland, and the Mediterranean, not with 18th century New England farming. And the solar alignments are consistent across dozens of sites, a pattern too deliberate for coincidence. The Putnam History Museum now runs guided hikes to the chambers. Visitors who enter them describe an interior peaked like a chapel, with stonework that suggests attention and care far beyond what a vegetable storage pit would require. Whether they are colonial root cellars, pre-Columbian ceremonial sites, or indigenous sacred structures that the mainstream archaeological community has simply refused to examine, the chambers sit in the woods, their doorways facing the sunrise, waiting for someone to take them seriously. Number 2. The Bluff Point Stoneworks. Between the two arms of Kuwango Lake and the Finger Lakes, a narrow bluff of land rises above the water. In the late 18th century, when the first European settlers arrived in Yates County, they found something on that bluff that did not belong to any culture they recognized. Stone structures covering roughly 7 acres, with graded walkways 3 to 8 feet wide bordered by flat upright stones, rectilinear compartments laid out with near mathematical precision, stone circles, arcs, and an 8-foot-tall monolith. When they asked the Seneca who built it, the Seneca said the structures were already ancient when their ancestors arrived. No oral tradition claimed it. No legend explained it. In 1879, S. Hartright conducted the first formal survey. He described compartments and rooms of varying dimensions, rectilinear divisions that exceeded 500 feet in length, and upright stone slabs arranged in formations he had never encountered. His conclusion was blunt. This is one of the strangest structures in the state. I find nothing similar to it figured in any work on archaeology. He suggested the structure may belong to the age of the mound builders. Over the following century, theories accumulated like sediment. A 1966 newspaper article asked whether Norse explorers had reached the Finger Lakes before Columbus, citing a Seneca legend of a great canoe manned by men with flowing hair carrying shining shields on its side. Others pointed to engravings of human and animal heads that supposedly resembled Etruscan work. Eric Buitens, writing in 1980, proposed that Celts built the stoneworks as an archaeoastronomical observatory. Glenn Rogers argued the layout was unsuitable for a fort and suggested Jesuits, but acknowledged that Jesuits kept detailed records and none mentioned building anything at Bluff Point. The professional archaeological community never conducted a full excavation. And while they debated, the stoneworks were being destroyed. Farmers harvested the stones for chimneys and foundations. The Wagoner Mansion at the tip of Bluff Point was built partly from materials taken from the ruins. Berlin Hartright, writing in 1938, complained that an honest plea had been made to state authorities for the preservation of this unique remnant of a great Aboriginal structure. Nothing came of it. By 1985, the Bluff Point stoneworks were gone, obliterated by vineyards, drainage ditches, hay fields, farm work roads, and a pine plantation. Some researchers believe remnants may exist underground. Every few years, a group of amateur archaeologists travels to Bluff Point to attempt another excavation. They find fragments. They find questions. They do not find answers. The strangest structure in the state of New York was documented, debated, and then destroyed. Nobody ever explained who built it, why, or when. The Seneca did not know. The archaeologists did not agree. The farmers did not care. And now the stone is in the chimneys of houses whose owners have no idea where it came from. And number 1. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy itself. This final entry is not a ruin. It is not a mound or a chamber or a circle of stones. It is an idea, and it may be the most extraordinary structure ever built in New York. Sometime before European contact, likely between the 12th and 15th centuries, 5 warring nations in what is now upstate New York did something that political scientists still struggle to fully explain. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca stopped fighting and created the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, governed by the Ganondagan, the Great Law of Peace. The Great Law established a representative government with checks and balances, a separation of powers between war chiefs and peace chiefs, the right of women to nominate and remove leaders, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and a process for adding new nations to the Confederacy. The decision-making structure required consensus, unanimity, not majority rule. Every voice had to be heard. Every nation had to agree. The Onondaga served as the keepers of a central fire. The Mohawk and Seneca served as elder brothers. The Oneida and Cayuga as younger brothers. The system was designed so that power could not concentrate and authority could not be inherited. When Benjamin Franklin attended the Albany Congress in 1754, he observed the Haudenosaunee system and explicitly cited it as a model. "It would be a strange thing," he wrote, "if 6 nations of ignorant savages should be capable of forming such a union, and yet a like union should be impracticable for 10 or a dozen English colonies." The language was offensive. The observation was accurate. In 1988, the United States Senate passed a resolution acknowledging that the confederation of the original 13 colonies into one republic was influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois Confederacy. There is no archaeological site to visit. There is no ruin to photograph. The Great Law was transmitted orally, encoded in wampum belts, and carried in memory from generation to generation. It was not written down in English until the 19th century. The structure was not made of stone. It was made of agreement, and it is still in force. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy has never been dissolved. It continues to operate under the Great Law, with chiefs, clan mothers, and a grand council that meets at Onondaga, the traditional capital, in central New York. The oldest participatory democracy on Earth was not built in Athens. It was built in upstate New York by people who understood that the most durable structure you can create is not a wall, or a monument, or a burial mound. It is a set of rules that people agree to follow because the rules are worth following. The Great Law of Peace has been functioning for somewhere between 500 and 900 years. The United States Constitution has been functioning for 237. The student has not yet outlasted the teacher. And most American schoolchildren can name every clause of the Bill of Rights without ever learning where the idea came from. That is New York. Not the New York of skyscrapers and subway stations and stock exchanges. The New York that has stone chambers aligned to the solstice hidden in the forests of Putnam County. A prehistoric complex in the Finger Lakes that was destroyed before anyone could explain it. A 10,000-year-old campsite buried under a beach parking lot. A burial ground of 15,000 people paved over and forgotten for 3 centuries. Stone cairns near Woodstock dated to before Columbus. Earthwork ring forts along the Kuwango Creek that no culture has claimed. A 5,500-year-old permanent settlement on a quiet lake in Schuyler County that rewrote the prehistory of the entire Northeast. And a system of government so advanced that the nation built on top of it borrowed the blueprints and then spent 200 years pretending it came up with the idea on its own. The land is older than the state. The structures are older than the story. And the most extraordinary thing ever built in New York was never built of stone at all. These videos take serious time to research and build. If you think they're worth it, subscribing takes 1 second, and it goes a long way. Thanks for watching.